Let's unpack some of the definitions around the word dissociation. An issue to settle right up front that a lot of professionals ask me, so which is it, dissociation or disassociation? So the technically correct answer from a clinical perspective is dissociation. However, the word disassociation does still appear in an English language dictionary, and I've understood that it's a term that's often used in biology and chemistry. If a client of yours finds it easier to think of what they do as a disassociation, I certainly don't feel like I need to correct them. Yet, in talking amongst professionals, I do like us to know that the term is dissociation, to know what it means, and to know where it comes from. Before we define dissociation, I do think it's important we get on the same page about a working definition of trauma, because dissociation tends to occur as a result of unhealed trauma or stress. So you may already have your working definition of trauma that is informed either by your own lived experience or by other teachers that you've studied with. And by all means, hold on to those definitions because they're probably not wrong. Trauma is a very subjective construct that is studied through many different lenses and many different perspectives. When I'm asked for my kind of made simple definition of trauma, as the English teacher, I once more lean into the word origin. Trauma, the English language word trauma, comes from the Greek word traumatikos, meaning wound. So trauma is any unhealed human wound. Physical, emotional, sexual, spiritual. There are many different kinds of wounds we can experience. And it's generally not the trauma itself that is the problem. It is what happens when the trauma isn't given the time and space and resources that it needs to heal. Dissociation, looking at that word origin, comes from Latin. But I also think it's a fun story to discuss how we as psychological professionals even got this term dissociation. So it means to sever or separate or divide. That Latin root dissociatio means to sever, to separate, or to divide. So what is it we're dividing from? Typically the present moment or from aspects of self. Now the term dissociation was not new in the English language to the 1880s, although it was French psychiatrist and hypnotherapist Pierre Janet who began using dissociation as a psychological term around that time. In his native French, he actually coined it as désagrégation, which some linguists say would better be translated as disaggregated. Although for better or for worse, the American philosopher William James translated him at Harvard in 1906 and called it dissociation. And from there, Janet continued to use that term. So where a lot of human service professionals struggle is that dissociation can mean a lot of things. Yes, it certainly can. And that's something I want to help us further explore. When I do this course in a live setting or when I'm working with the client one-on-one, I'll often ask, what is it that we're severing or dividing from when we dissociate? So maybe even notice your gut level answer to that question right now. When we dissociate, what is it we're severing or dividing from? Typically, one of two things, and for some complex trauma survivors, it's of course both. That we're either severing or dividing from the present moment or present experience, usually because the present moment or present experience is overwhelming, upsetting, painful, even boring. Or that severing can happen as parts or aspects of self, or parts or aspects of experience. And the concept of parts has, of course, become more popular in present psychological discourse. And we often think of part systems as being like mine that I shared with you, having 3 or 4 different age states. But parts of self or experience can also be the body-mind-soul separation, the separation we may feel between our human self or our more divine self when we want there to be unity. So dissociation can mean a lot of things. And if you're confused right now, I would encourage you to embrace that confusion. It can actually help you as we engage in more of these explorations. There are many neurological functions and protections that contribute to the existence of dissociation. So we are not specifically a neurobiologist in our training. We are much more an English teacher than we are a scientist, even in our approach of trauma. And several of the supplementary resources in the course portal will take you a little deeper into the neurobiology. But there is a good reason that dissociation happens, that it is a protective function. And when we talk about protective functions in the brain, we often think about the brain stem, we think about the amygdala, we think about the endogenous opioid system, which is our brain's natural pain relieving capacity. And all of these functions can get activated during traumatic or stressful experiences, causing some phenomenon of dissociation. What I'm more interested in exploring here is, why is it that we dissociate? And that's our next bullet point here, that dissociation generally happens to protect, either protect the self or the system, or to meet a need. And even right now, you may pause and think, when was the last time I experienced even a light degree of dissociation? And did that happen to protect myself? To meet some kind of need? Maybe both. Next, I'd like us to explore that dissociation can be adaptive or maladaptive, which is an important component of this course. Sometimes dissociation can be both, depending on the context. So these terms I'm using, adaptive and maladaptive, specifically come from EMDR therapy founder Dr. Francine Shapiro. Because this is my main therapeutic approach, I tend to lean into a lot of EMDR terms, although you do not have to be an EMDR therapist to use this verbiage. Shapiro leaned into the words adaptive and maladaptive instead of healthy or unhealthy, good or bad, because she felt that even human services professionals could use those as a bit of a value judgment. Whereas adaptive and maladaptive tends to suggest more of a sense of subjectivity. What is adaptive for you may not be adaptive for me. So for example, as a person on an abstinence-based path of recovery, having that glass of wine with my friends at the end of a day is not adaptive for me, but it may be very adaptive for many of you who are watching this course. If the terms adaptive or maladaptive feel a little too technical, you can think in terms of helpful or unhelpful. And certainly when you work with kids, that good or bad, okay, not okay language can be leaned into. Yet with adults, we find that those languages can cause people to judge themselves. And with dissociation, we are really invested in helping people to see that it serves a purpose. One of the chapters of my new book, Dissociation Made Simple, is called Dissociation is Not a Dirty Word. It is the reason so many of us are here. It is the reason so many of us have survived, and it's the reason that so many of us can continue to cope. So can dissociation be maladaptive, unhelpful, problematic? For sure. And we will be exploring that idea later in this module as we listen to the voices of more trauma survivors. Many of these survivors speak to how dissociation has been both helpful for them and certainly unhelpful or maladaptive in their journeys. And sometimes it can be both, depending on the context. A story that I like to share from my own life and recovery journey is when I first got sober and was working with my mentor. She helped me to see that growing up as a kid in a dysfunctional environment, daydreaming, dissociating was what I needed to stay alive. At a certain point, especially as I crossed this threshold into adulthood and needing to interact more with reality, the daydreaming became problematic for me. It was something that promoted more unhelpful dissociation and eventually addiction. Now, has recovery for me meant that I've had to let go of daydreaming altogether? Absolutely not. It's the source of so much of my creativity and wonder. But what recovery has meant is learning how to do an evaluation or at least some kind of inventory around when am I dissociating helpfully or adaptively and when is it maladaptive. And in a later module, I will guide you through an exercise that helps us do that same exploration. And wrapping this up, healing with dissociation-related issues can take on many shapes and textures on this journey to a working wholeness. Wholeness is a word, is a concept that works very well for me and many other survivors of trauma, as opposed to other terms like integration or fusion. Because yes, whole suggests that there may be separate and distinct parts, separate and distinct shards. Yet these parts, these aspects, these experiences of our lives can certainly be worked with so that we can experience life as a whole person, a whole system who is capable of healing and optimal functioning.